Please won't you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together find their way into the heart of God this morning. Amen. So a man who had reached his 100th birthday was being interviewed by a reporter, and no, it wasn't Ken Day, but maybe it could have been. "What are you the most proud of?" the reporter asked. "Well," said the man, "I don't have an enemy in the world." Wow, what a beautiful thought, the reporter said. How inspirational. What is your secret? And the man said, "I outlived every single one of them." I like his strategy. There's only one problem with it, though. The only person I know for sure you and I can never outlive is ourselves. Jesus tells us to love our enemies. And just like we can't love our neighbors if we don't love ourselves first, we can't love our enemies if we don't love ourselves first either. So the first rule about preaching is to never tell your congregation about your process. But I'm going to break that rule because I like breaking rules. I struggled mightily with this sermon. I rewrote it probably 6 times. It was because I got stuck on one question that I just could not get past. I don't know why. It might have just been the week. But like the lawyer who tries to trick Jesus with the question, "Who is my neighbor?" I got all caught up in this question, "Who is my enemy?" It's not that I don't have an answer to that question. It's just that I have too many complex answers. Do you know what I mean? So I've created more than a few enemies in my lifetime. Sometimes I have produced enemies from hurtful mistakes that I've made, certainly. But mostly, I've made enemies by taking bold action or telling hard truths. I want you to notice for a moment in our scriptures that Jesus doesn't advise us to be more likable in his sermon on the level place, right? He tells us instead to love those who hate us. He assumes that there are already people who will, right? He tells us instead to love those who hate us. I can't think of a harder thing to be asked to do. Can you? My colleague Taryn said that if everyone's your friend, you're doing life wrong, which is partially what Jesus meant, I think. Get yourself an enemy, then love them, right? Or as someone once said, live your life in such a way that Westboro Baptist comes to pick at your funeral. Amen? Right. So I did a funeral that Westboro Baptist didn't picket this week for one of the great pillars of the church, Bob Smiley, Malcolm's brother. And I learned so much about him this week. He has now joined the saints in light. Amen? He had every leadership position there was to have in this church, from moderator to deacon. And apparently, he used to advise lay leaders that it was good to be in trouble with someone here at First Church. He said it meant that something positive was happening if that were the case. That some kind of good change was afoot if you were in trouble with someone. Like, make good trouble, right? I took that advice immediately to heart as soon as I heard it, as I am always in trouble with someone around these parts. So I intended to preach some version of Taylor Swift's immortal words, "Haters gonna hate," right? Love anyway. I was going to preach Howard Thurman's wisdom. Don't let other people's hatred become your own, right? Because I think that's Jesus' wisdom. Don't become the thing that you disdain. But still, I kept getting caught up in this question: who is my enemy? So I did what preachers do. I looked to the scriptures for other instances of the word enemy. It's in there a lot. But because I did 2 funerals this week, I recited the 23rd Psalm a lot. You remember that psalm, right? So many of us have it memorized. The part of the 23rd Psalm that is most compelling for me is the line that says, God sets a table before me in the presence of my enemies. He anoints my head with oil, my cup overflows. And sometimes I imagine an extravagant table filled with bread and chocolate and fine linens and silver candlesticks and my cup overflowing with wine. I picture God setting a place before me in the presence of my ex-mother-in-law and the mean girls from Runlet Junior High School and the first man who broke my heart and domestic terrorists and Ann Coulter, maybe. And I imagine God serving up a big pot of steaming, hot chicken soup with dumplings. My enemies are watching me carefully place my napkin in my lap, and they are salivating. And I imagine Jesus teaching me to pray before we eat, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us as we forgive others. Lead us not into temptation." And then maybe Jesus gives Ann Coulter the stink eye before saying, "And deliver us from evil," right? Amen. But in biblical terms, there are 2 kinds of enemies: the demonic kind and the human kind. And in the 23rd Psalm, David is referring to demonic enemies, right? David's not referring to my ex-mother-in-law at all, but to the ways in which Satan, the accuser, attempts to steal our own worth. God is there in the midst of all of that, reminding us that the banquet he's set before us is the presence of all that holds us back from love's glory. But I kept asking that question: who is my enemy then? What about when enemies have a human face, Jesus? So I decided to ask all of you who your enemies were when I got home from a long day yesterday of pastoral care training for lay folks in Providence. And I asked you on Facebook, and I asked you late at night. And I got hundreds of answers. The answers weren't really wearing human faces like I thought they would be. They were more what than who. Do you know what I mean? So, who is your enemy, I asked, and you said things like ignorance and fear and expectations and ego and oppression and autocorrect. Amen. And hatred and worry and alcohol and capitalism and the New York Yankees and fossil fuel companies and disco and systems that support secrets and apathy and exhaustion and judgment and people who ask for Saturday night sermon writing help. And some of you named people who have harmed you: Nazis, your exes, people who deny the humanity of others. But here's what surprised me most of all, and what changed the direction of my sermon. Most of you said that you are, in fact, your own worst enemy. And it kind of broke my heart, and I couldn't let it go. More than half of you said some version of the enemy inside my head is the voice inside my head is my enemy. The part of me that second guesses every decision is my enemy. The part of me that tells me I'm worthless is my enemy. The part that tells me that I'm not good enough inside of me, that's my biggest enemy. You said that over and over and over again. So you didn't answer the way that I expected you to, with your political opponents or the people in the internet comments section or the kids who always picked you last for teams in gym class, or your critical grandmother who told you you were fat and lazy, or the people who have violated your bodies even over the years, right, with violence. You told me instead that the accuser resides inside of you. The enemy, it seems, is not just external to us, but inside of us. It's like the horror movie when the actor suddenly realizes the call is coming from inside the house. But here's what I know to be true, and the only thing I really want you to know this morning, and that is that God is there too, inside the house. God sets a table there in the midst of our fears and insecurities and our apathy and our anxiety and our depression and our tendency to beat ourselves up. And God says, your worth is determined by my love, not the accuser's hate. Here, have some soup, right? So Jesus says, love your enemy. Just like we can't love our neighbors if we don't love ourselves, we can't love the enemy if we don't love ourselves. So the word used in this passage from Luke for love is agape in Greek. It's not the Hallmark kind of love. It isn't the doormat kind of love. It is the rebel kind of love. It is the brave, wholehearted, unreserved, unconditional desire for the well-being of the other kind of love. It is the expecting nothing in return kind of love. And so I want us to imagine together what it might look like to give brave, wholehearted, unreserved, unconditional desire for our own well-being kind of love to ourselves. Can we do that? Expecting nothing from ourselves in return. So not a thinner body or a reprieve from foot and mouth syndrome or remembering to send thank you notes, right? Just an unconditional kind of love for ourselves. Barbara Brown Taylor, who's an Episcopal priest and writer, thinks we should pray naked in front of the mirror. So, okay, just stay with me for a minute. I meant alone, okay? Or she means alone, I didn't say this. She recommends that from time to time we take off our clothes, look at ourselves in the mirror, and tell ourselves with as much tenderness as we possibly can muster, here I am, this is the body like no other that my life has shaped. I live here. This is my soul's address. Thankfully, Jesus left us a blueprint for how to love like that He told us how to see the divine in the faces of our enemies, even if we see the face of our enemy in the mirror. He said, do good to them, bless them, and pray for them. So, beloved, if your worst enemy is yourself, go home tonight, take off your clothes alone, and pray naked in front of the mirror. Look at yourselves with as much gentleness as you can muster. Look at every stretch mark and wrinkle and mole and hair or lack thereof, and let your body tell the story of where you've been. Embrace yourself with the kindness that can only come from a wastefully, extravagantly loving God. And tell the devil, get thee behind me, Satan, if he tries to tell you something different. Your life has been shaped in that body of yours. It is your soul's address. Let God carefully set a table before you in the presence of all the demonic forces in your life that have led you to believe that you are not worthy of that love. And then sit down at that table with God and eat some delicious enemy pie. Amen.